Our guest this evening is Brian Freeman, an international best-selling author of 5 psychological suspense novels featuring Lieutenant Jonathan Stride. His latest book, The Bone House, is a standalone, meaning that it's not part of the Jonathan Stride series, and it's set in Door County. On Brian's website, he states, "My goal is to write books with haunting characters and a lightning-fast pace. My stories are about the hidden, intimate motives that draw people across some terrible lines. The twists and turns keep you turning the pages, and each piece in the puzzle gives you new insight into the heroes, victims, and villains." Brian credits his grandmother and his 8th grade composition teacher for encouraging him to become obsessed with crime fiction and writing. After many years of writing suspense fiction, Brian published Immoral in 2005 and has published 5 more since then: Stripped, Stalked, In the Dark, and The Burying Place. And The Burying Place, published just last year, has been nominated for Best Novel in the International Thriller Awards competition, which is sponsored by the International Thriller Writers Organization. Tonight, Brian will speak about his newest novel, The Bone House, and the world of publishing. After he has finished speaking, he'll gladly answer any of your questions. So now, please join me in welcoming Brian Freeman.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here in Janesville tonight. This is a wonderful facility. We've been to a lot of libraries in different parts of the country, and this is a really terrific location. So you're very lucky to have this facility in town. Well, thank you very much for coming to talk to me tonight. I've noticed kind of an interesting phenomenon, and that is when you write books that have titles like Immoral, Stripped, and Stalked, which was the title of the first 3 books, you sort of find that people are very anxious to read the books, but they're a little nervous about the idea of getting to know you personally. And I used to think, well, that's just my imagination, but I went to a book signing at Once Upon a Crime in Minneapolis, which is this wonderful little mystery bookstore in Minneapolis, and met this gentleman there, and he told me that his book club had read my first book, Immoral, and loved it. And I said, well, that's great. Why you should have called me. I'd have been happy to join the book club discussion, because I do that a lot. And he looked at me rather sheepishly and said, well, we all kind of took a look at your photo on your website, and we thought you looked kind of scary. So I have a new photo on my website now. Hopefully this is the non-scary version. But yeah, I actually found when Immoral came out, there's some unusual side effects to these sort of salacious one-word titles that we had at the beginning. My mom lives out in California, and naturally when Immoral came out, she was sort of my marketer in chief, so she was telling all of her friends they had to go out and buy her son's book. So she told her doctor this at the clinic, and sure enough, he went out, bought a copy of Immoral, read it, loved it, wanted to make sure that he remembered to tell her this the next time she came in for an appointment. So he wrote Immoral on a Post-it note, put it in her file, and the next time my mom went to the clinic, she ended up seeing a different doctor who was looking at her very strangely the entire time. So the next time she went to her regular doctor, he comes into the office laughing. Turns out this other doctor had come to him after the appointment and said, "Why did you put that note in her file? She seems like such a nice woman." So fortunately, we don't have these sort of salacious one-word titles. We've gone in a new direction, but I'll tell you a little bit about kind of how I got started in this business, and talk a little bit about the books and what I'm trying to do with them, and then I'm happy to answer any questions for you as well. You know, people will sometimes ask me, when did you decide that you wanted to become a writer? And the honest truth of the matter is, I really never wanted to be anything else. That's been my life's dream as far back as I can remember. I can remember being in 6th grade. I was starting work on a mystery novel in class, which tells you how closely I was paying attention. And I actually got into 8th grade, and I had this wonderful composition teacher, and she did something, you know, I think these days with all the standardized tests and curricula, it would be pretty hard for a teacher to do, but she told me, you know, when you come to my class, don't worry about the lesson plans, just sit there and write your stories. And that's what I did for her class. And it was right after her class that I sat down and wrote my first full-length novel over the next year and a half. And from that point forward, I really had the bug. That was what I wanted to do with my life, and that was my dream. Didn't really realize at the time just what a challenging dream that was. In fact, I was fairly naive about it, as young writers tend to be. But in fact, I can remember I went to Carleton, and that's where I met my soon-to-be wife. And I can remember we were walking around Northfield at one point, and I was explaining to her in great detail how I was going to support us as a writer, and kind of left out that part about it taking 20 years to get there. Fortunately, she stuck around along the way. But you know, writing is the kind of business where you don't get a lot of positive reinforcement along the way. I actually wrote a total of 5 novels in my life before I ever even started the book that became Immoral. And I would send out queries to agents and publishers, and it's not like you get these little personal notes back saying, oh, I really like that, you know, work a little bit on this, but I like where you're going, you're going to make it, just keep at it. No, you get the samples back, and the paper clip is hardly creased, and the sample's in pristine condition. So you know that nobody spent 10 seconds looking at what you sent in. So there were a lot of days throughout those years that it would have been a lot easier to just say, you know, gosh, there are other things that I want to do with my life, and other goals that I want to achieve. And fortunately, I just sort of decided that I needed to try again. And despite having written 5 novels in the course of my life, I thought, you know, I'm gonna take another run at this, and I'm gonna start number 6. And number 6 was the book that became Immoral, which was the book that broke through. You know, and I really believe that sort of life happens the way it does for a reason. I was getting Immoral ready, and kind of to the point where I was ready to start trying to do something with it. And I knew I wanted to do something different, because I thought, you know, the standard route of just sending in all sorts of queries just did not seem to be very effective. And so I was sort of looking for a different business model to consider. And what I actually started doing was reading the acknowledgments pages of first novels that I had enjoyed, because I kind of wanted to get a sense of what was this author doing that I wasn't. What had they done to break through that I had missed? And what I found was that in almost every case, the author had developed sort of a key relationship to sort of help them get their foot in the door and get someone to pay attention to them. In fact, the one I enjoyed the most was Joseph Finder. His first book was The Moscow Hour, and I read it, I enjoyed it, I got through to the end, and I was reading the acknowledgments, and you get to the very last paragraph of the acknowledgments, and he says, I'd like to offer a very special thanks for all of his help to my brother, who is editorial director of the New Yorker magazine. So that was a pretty good connection. Unfortunately, my brother has been a computer programmer at Bank of America for 35 years, so that wasn't going to be quite as helpful in the same way. But as I say, things kind of happen for a reason, and right around the time that Immoral was kind of ready to go, I found out quite by accident that one of the folks in the London office of the company I was working with was going to be going to an alumni event in London with a woman who was an agent at one of London's largest literary agencies. So I sprang into action and sent Robert an email and asked if he would make an introduction and see if this agent would be willing to read my manuscript. And Robert was gracious enough to agree to do so, and Allie, the agent, was drunk enough to say yes, so I sent her the manuscript, and a couple days later I heard back from her assistant saying, "Yep, Allie has the book in hand. She's looking forward to reading it. You ought to hear something in 6 to 8 weeks." Well, I'd been down this road with agents many times, so I certainly was not getting my hopes up. And then 1 week later, got an email from Allie herself saying, "Stayed up until 1 in the morning finishing the book, couldn't put it down. I've already called a UK publisher saying, this guy's the next Harlan Coben, want to represent you, call me immediately." So I peeled myself off the ceiling and I called Allie, and Allie is this amazing force of nature. So she's like, "Oh, yes, darling, I love the book, and I'll handle the UK deal, and my agency will work on international sales. And I could do the US deal myself, but I've got a co-agent in New York that I like to work with who also handles Jeffrey Deaver, and I'd like her to do the US deal. Would that be acceptable?" And it's like, "Yeah, I think that'll be okay." So they went out, and 4 of the longest weeks of my life later, we had 2 book deals in both the U.S. and UK, and then I started getting these little emails from the Curtis Brown agency in London saying that we've sold the rights to your book in Italian, and we've sold the rights to your book in Polish, and we've sold the rights to your book in Swedish, and then Bookspan, which at the time owned book clubs all over the world, selected Immoral as their International Book of the Month. And that meant that Immoral became the main selection in the Literary Guild and the Book of the Month Club and book clubs around the world. And when the dust had settled, we'd sold the rights to Immoral in 17 languages, and we were sort of off to the races. And of course, at that point, people started saying, "Well, gosh, you're sort of like an overnight success." And I said, "Well, yeah, overnight, as long as you skip that 20 years of abject failure along the way." But it has been an amazing ride over the past few years, and it's the sort of thing that makes me very glad that I didn't sort of give up after that 5th book went into the nightstand drawer and decided to keep at it. But let me tell you a little bit about what I'm trying to do with my books and the kinds of books that I write. I'll tell you a story from a long time ago, back in the 80s, long before I broke through as a writer. I was working at a mortgage banking company in St. Paul, and had to travel around and visit branches throughout the Midwest. And I got to know a woman who was a loan processing supervisor down in the Kansas City office. And I went down there one time, and I was having lunch with her, and I could tell that something was bothering her. And I finally asked her what was going on. And she told me that some 20 years earlier, her ex-husband had kidnapped their daughter. And she had not seen her daughter in all of that time. And she had just the past week rediscovered where her daughter was, and they were going to be reunited for the first time that coming weekend. And I have always remembered that amazing story, because it was such an example of something that I have found sort of time and time again throughout my life. And that is that all you have to do is scratch the surface with ordinary people, and you get these amazing stories coming out. Stories of tragedy and triumph and suffering and hope and faith and despair, and that's all a long way of saying that that's what I'm trying to do with my novels, is to honor and write about those kinds of stories. So what you find in my books is sort of an intimate family drama. It's suspense, and yet it's suspense that ultimately is rooted in the backgrounds and the psychology of the characters. So I don't write sort of the forensic drama that, say, a Patricia Cornwell does. So it's not about fingerprints and friction ridges and bone radiography and all this sort of CSI stuff. And even though there are police investigations in the books, they're not really police procedurals the way, say, Michael Connelly would write. If I have to put a label on it, I would call it sort of psychological suspense, and that means it's suspense where the drama emerges out of the emotions and the secrets and the backgrounds of the characters. And so as you read the book, it not only should keep you turning the pages that you have to find out what happens next, but it also should feel like you're putting the pieces together in the psychological puzzles, so that by the time you reach the ending, it's not only shocking and unexpected, but it also helps you suddenly understand the full dimensions of the characters and what the motivations were that drew them across some difficult lives. So in fact, what I often will tell people is I always suggest that you sort of read my novels twice, because the first time you read it, you're going to be going through and you kind of have to keep turning the pages, and you want to find out what happens and what's going on. And I always say, okay, once you're done and you've got that, you've reached the ending, go back and read the book a second time more slowly, because you're going to pick up nuances among the characters that you may have missed the first time through. And when you read the scenes, knowing what's really going on in the lives of the characters, suddenly it changes the whole dynamic of those scenes, because you suddenly understand what's really going on and the subtext that's happening between the characters in the books. So those are the kinds of books I write. Immoral was the first, and I now have six books out. Well, I actually have 7 books out, and I'll tell you about the secret 7th book. But Immoral was the first, and Immoral introduced this character of Jonathan Stride. And when I was creating the character of Stride, I deliberately did not want sort of the grizzled, stereotypical, emotionless detective. I wasn't looking for kind of a Sam Spade character where he's kind of ironic and detached from what's going on around him, and the suit is always perfectly pressed. I wanted someone in Stride who at his heart is a pretty passionate guy, but someone who struggles with his emotions and does not always make the right choices. And that's kind of a hallmark of my books, is I don't really like superheroes or supervillains. I want to have books where all of the characters feel real and flawed and complex, and I want you to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of each of those characters and sort of ask yourself, what would I have done if I were faced with similar circumstances? Well, when I was creating Stride, I needed sort of a locale for Stride, and where was he going to be? And I decided that he was such a Midwesterner and such a classic northern Minnesota kind of guy that I wanted to set the books in Duluth. And the most common question I seem to get is, why Duluth? And oddly, that's a question I get fairly regularly in Duluth. You'd sort of think they'd figure, well, we've got this jewel on the shores of Superior, but I think it's that Midwestern, well, why would anyone want to write about us? But I first visited Duluth a long time ago. In fact, my then fiancée and I took a driving tour up the North Shore while we were in college, which is a trip my parents still don't know about. We've only been married 27 years. They're not ready for it yet. But so we went through Duluth, and I can remember thinking even back then that it would be the perfect place to set suspense novels, because it's got this wonderful combination of elements that work for the kinds of books that I write. Obviously, it's in a very extreme locale, and I think extremes really enrich the character of drama. And so as you read my books, you'll find that weather ends up playing a fairly significant role in a lot of books, and I think that's partly because weather plays a pretty significant role in the day-to-day life of Midwesterners. But there's more to that about Duluth. I think there's the natural environment of the city as well. I kind of think of Duluth as sort of almost like a frontier outpost that's kind of holding back the Canadian wilderness, and it feels like it's in sort of a fragile location that requires a certain toughness of spirit, and I like that about Duluth. And there's a culture of sort of faded glory about Duluth. It's a city that had a very moneyed, glamorous past in its old days. In fact, at the early part of the 20th century, Duluth was actually the highest grossing tonnage port in the whole country. It was ahead of New York. And so there were just tremendous fortunes made in mining and shipping back in those days. And it's all pretty much bled away, and it's left with this very hard scrabble city. And yet you go up into the streets and you see these sort of old Victorian homes, and it's kind of an echo of the glamour of Duluth's past. And I kind of like that sorrowful quality about the city, and I thought that reflected some of the emotion and the intensity and the tragedy that tends to go on in my books. So that's why Duluth and Stride sort of became partners together. Well, my second book was Stripped, and I actually took Stride out of Duluth in Stripped, and for one book I dropped him down in Las Vegas, of all places. I say that extremes enrich the character of drama, and so I figured that Las Vegas is sort of extreme like Duluth, but on opposite ends of the spectrum. So you've got this very cold, closed-off city in Duluth, and you've got this very hot, wide-open city in Las Vegas. And I sort of like the idea of this northern Minnesota detective sort of battling Las Vegas to a draw. And we had a great response from readers to Stripped, and the book was named one of the top 10 mysteries of 2006 by the Florida Sun-Sentinel. So it was really well received, and I always enjoyed getting the emails from readers who would say, you know, I loved Stripped, but please tell me Stride's going back to Duluth. And I assured them that yes, Stride has to return home to Minnesota. So. My third book was Stalked, and that is sort of an ice-cold winter thriller. And in fact, when I was doing the research for Stalked, Marcia and I spent all of January 2006 in a little cottage out on Park Point in Duluth. An excursion that did not win me many points at home, I will say. One of the things I try to do with my books is I want to capture sort of a you are there feel, and I want you to feel as if you've been dropped down in the middle of the action, and you can hear it and feel it and touch it and taste it and smell it going on around you. And one of the ways that I do that is I scout locations for the books, sort of the way a film director would, and I match up the location to the scene. And I go there and I record my impressions, and I know what it feels like to be in that environment, and I can then kind of pour that into the book. So if you're reading Stalked and you really feel like you're standing out in the middle of a blizzard with ice balls hanging from your eyelids, it's because I was standing out on the beach on Park Point in the middle of one of Duluth's storms with my voice recorder recording my impressions as this was all going on. So. Well, my fourth book was In the Dark, and In the Dark is one of my personal favorites among the books because it may be the most emotional of the novels. It delves very deeply into Stride's past and helps you understand him as a hero. At the beginning of Immoral, before the actual start of the manuscript, Stride has lost his wife of 20 years to cancer, and is dealing with the grief that goes along with that, and that grief ripples through Immoral and puts Stride in a situation where he does not always see things the way they really are, and does not always make the right judgments because of what he's going through. And I really wanted to give readers an opportunity to find more about Stride's relationship with Cindy, his first wife, and that's really the heart of In the Dark. In the Dark takes place both in the present and back in the 1970s, and it deals with an unsolved crime from back then, in which Cindy's sister was murdered, and the crime was never solved. And in the present day, a writer comes back to town to do a book about this crime, and Stride gets pulled into it all over again, and not only has to deal with the ripples from that crime that continue to affect the area, but also has to deal with how those events of that summer shaped him as a man and as a detective, and all of the unresolved issues of grief from the loss of his wife sort of come storming back on stride in that book, and creates some havoc for his current relationships as well. So it's a very intense, emotional novel, and I was delighted with how it came together, and it's still one of those books where I read the last chapter and I still break up every time I read it. So that's good. And then my fifth novel, which is the most recent Stride novel, is The Burying Place, and another very emotional novel, because Stride is sort of dealing with the repercussions of things that happened in the dark. And I was just delighted that a couple weeks ago, The Burying Place was named a finalist for Best Novel of 2010 in the International Thriller Writer Awards. I'm in pretty good company, because the other nominees are UK writer Mo Hyder, John Sanford, Jeffrey Deaver, and Michael Connolly. So be crossing your fingers for me in July when the awards are announced. Well, those were the first 5 books, and after everything that I had put Stride through in those books, I thought the poor guy needed a vacation. So I decided to write a standalone book, a book that is set outside the Stride series, and that's The Bone House, which is the new book that just came out a few weeks ago. And The Bone House, the inspiration for The Bone House emerged out of an actual experience that some good friends of ours went through, and it was a circumstance where this friend of ours was accused essentially of some inappropriate behavior in his job, and he was innocent of it, and yet he was in a circumstance where sort of everyone made the presumption that he was guilty, and it put a great strain on their relationship, and his wife had to deal with sort of the aura of guilt that everyone placed on him, and had to sort of dig deep down for her own faith and her own trust in him and the man she'd married. And I thought that what they had gone through had the makings of one of my books, and so I actually talked to them and asked if they would mind if I would sort of take that kernel of inspiration and turn it into one of my novels, and they said yes. And so The Bone House emerges out of that, and the central characters of The Bone House are a couple, a husband and wife, and the husband, they live out in Door County, up on Washington Island, and the husband is a teacher who had lost his job in the wake of suspicions that he'd had an affair with a student, even though both he and the student had denied it. And then when the sister of that student is found murdered, all of the town leaps to the conclusion that he's guilty, and his wife Hillary is the only one that still believes that her husband did not do this, and is intent upon trying to find out what really happened to this girl, and has to try to convince a detective from outside the area not to sort of prejudge, along with everyone else, that Mark is guilty despite the evidence. So it's a book that not only has, again, all of the sort of twists and turns that I like to put in, but it's a book that delves deeply into themes of trust and faith and doubt, and at the heart it's about that relationship between Mark and Hillary Bradley, and how Mark deals with the stress of being falsely accused, and how Hillary deals with that kernel of doubt that sort of nestles inside her about what really happened, and how far she can trust the man that she married. So I've been delighted with the reader response to The Bone House. You always get a little nervous as an author when you do something different and you take a break from something like a series. But I've been hearing from readers who've been saying, "Well, gosh, I was nervous I was going to miss Stride, but I loved the book." So that's what I like to hear. And then I mentioned there's actually another book out there that I've written, which a lot of people don't realize it's me, because actually does not have my name on it. The book is called The Agency, and the author's name is Allie O'Brien. And you'll recall that my agent was Allie, and I'm Brian, so we had a little fun with that. We decided to use a pseudonym because it is absolutely nothing like my suspense novels. My suspense novels tend to be very dark and emotionally intense. This book it's kind of Sex and the City meets The Devil Wears Prada meets Janet Ivanovich. So it's absolutely nothing like my other books, and we decided to use the pseudonym because we figured nobody would believe it was really me that had written it. But what happened was a few years ago, my agent Allie, she had always wanted to do a book set in the sort of wild and woolly London publishing industry, and she's not a writer, so she came to me and asked, was it the kind of thing that I would be interested in doing? So I had just finished off Stalked at that point, and I thought, well, that sounds kind of fun. It almost sounds like a vacation to write something quite that different. So we sat down and we developed a plot and characters, and I started writing the book, and it was fun because I'm used to writing these very emotionally wrenching sorts of books where tears are running down my face as I'm trying to type, and this one's just, it was just a hoot to write. So it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to pull together, and I hope it's a lot of fun to read as well. So if you want to see the other side of Brian Freeman, you can try the agency. But that's kind of what I've been doing over the last few years. It has been a tremendous ride. The author's life is never quite kind of what it looks like from the outside, and we're self-employed, and that brings all of its own stresses, and the last couple of years have been brutal for authors and publishers and booksellers alike. So it's sort of a roller coaster ride in terms of the lifestyle, but it offers a tremendous amount of satisfaction, largely because it's such an honor to be able to talk to readers and find out how your books have an impact on them. I know that I've had so many wonderful authors in my life that have played a role in my life, even though I never met them, and so the opportunity to be able to do that for readers around the world is just a tremendous experience. And I get great emails from people. I've heard from teachers dealing with students that they're trying to inspire as readers. I've heard from soldiers serving overseas. I've heard from people who are reading in the hospital dealing with the deaths of spouses and parents and children. And it is always a reminder of the power that a story has to lift people out of their current circumstances and transport them somewhere completely different. So it's a great opportunity to be able to provide those kinds of stories for readers. Now, I will tell you that every now and then it does create some unusual circumstances. For one thing, many of the readers that write to me, I will actually hear from them in foreign languages because they're reading the books in translation. So I've had to become familiar with online translators to get a sense of what it is these people are actually saying to me. And I don't know if you've had a chance to use online translators much, but suffice it to say they're a little rough. So I thought I was being very clever, and I would take my replies and run them through an online translator so that I could reply in their language. And I started thinking, gosh, I wonder what it is I'm saying to these people. So I took one of my replies and ran it through the other way, and discovered to my horror that my typical email sign-off, which is "with warmest wishes," was coming out in Spanish as "with hottest desires." So we did really well in Spain. I don't know if there's a connection, but well, that's a little bit about the writer's life. What kind of questions can I answer for you guys?
How long does it take you to write a book?
How long does it take to write a book? Well, it's a lot shorter now than it used to be when I was fitting it in around a typical 9-to-5 job. Immoral, my first book, took about 2.5 years to get the first draft done, and probably another year and a half of editing. Now the process takes about a year. It's about 2 or 3 months of developing the characters and the plots and putting the outline together of sort of how the book is told. It's probably about 5 or 6 months of actually getting the words on paper and writing the draft. And then it's another 2 or 3 months of editorial. I'm sort of a fanatic editor that I'm constantly going back and tweaking every sentence and every word. You could hand me one of the books now and I'd open it up and I'd start editing it. So sooner or later I have to kind of cut myself off and say, okay, I'm done. And usually that's about a year into the process. So. Yeah?
You said you had written 5 novels beforehand.
Right.
Have you ever gone back to those novels, or are they just sitting there waiting to maybe look at one day?
You know, they're still sitting in my nightstand drawer. Now this does include going back all the way to the one I wrote when I was 13. So there aren't too many publishers that are interested in handwritten novels on binder paper. But although I pulled it out of my drawer the other day and took a look at it, well, that wasn't so bad for 13. Would I go back to those books? Probably not. You know, there might be ideas or themes or characters that I would try to pull forward at some point, but you know, the reality is it's much more satisfying working on projects now where I'm sort of being able to bring all of my craft experience and all of my life experience to bear on each new project, as opposed to going back to something that was written 15 years ago and reflects who I was then, and sort of try to bring it up to that same level. So if I were to do anything, it might be, I might try to release something as sort of a bonus book for readers to give them sort of a little flavor of what my early style was like. One of the books was a novella set in a revival Shaker community in northern Minnesota, and the hero of that book is, when you read that, is a very clear antecedent to Stride. And you can kind of see in that character, Daniel Barrett, how Stride emerged a few years later. So sometime it might be kind of fun to pull that out for readers just to get a sense of sort of who Stride's creative ancestor was in my earlier books. So.
That's something I'd be interested in.
Yes, okay, all right. Duly noted. Yeah?
I have 2 questions. One is, in the back of the book here, on the jacket, it says, your Stride novels feature detectives Jonathan Stride and Serena Dial.
Yes.
But you didn't mention Serena Dial. Here it makes it sound like they're partners, but I'm suspecting she's a little less than that because you didn't really mention.
Okay, I'll talk about Serena, all right.
And my second question is, who picks your titles, you or your publishers?
Oh, both good questions. There are actually 3 primary series characters. Stride is sort of the dominant character in the stories, but Serena and Maggie are the other 2 characters in the books who have prominent roles, and there's sort of an ongoing emotional triangle among those 3 that continues and goes in various directions over the course of the books. Not that I don't deliberately mention Serena. Serena's sort of the more glamorous cop, and in fact, she hails from Las Vegas, and so Stride met her in the context of the investigation in Las Vegas, and Maggie is this. Maggie's one of readers' favorite characters. She's this little Chinese cop up in Duluth, and she's become one of the most popular characters in the books. And I've told people the interesting thing about Maggie is that when I was first outlining Immoral, she wasn't even in the book. As I started the early chapters of Immoral, I realized that Stride was such a sort of serious, intense kind of hero that he needed someone that could kind of poke him in the ribs and cut him down to size a bit. And so I just loved the idea of this little Chinese cop that would be able to boss around these big old Swedish Duluth cops. And so I put Maggie in the book, and she sort of demanded a larger role. And so she ended up coming back again and again in the book. And she's not in Stripped because Stripped takes Stride out of Duluth for that book. But she's kind of the centerpiece of Stalked, and it really revolves around Maggie's story. So it's that they're kind of the triangle of the books, and after things that happened in the burying place, readers are sort of anxious to find out what happens next with the 3 of them. So so I'm starting the next Stride book this summer, so we'll find out soon. And as for titles. It's a good question because titles, I've learned not to become very emotionally attached to titles because they almost always change. In fact, The Burying Place is the only book where the title was the same all the way through the process. That was my working title of the manuscript, all the way through to the publication process. In every other case, the title has changed at least once along the way. Immoral, my working title was Rachel's Body. And publishers around the world were united in two things. One, they loved the book, and two, the title was not going to be Rachel's Body. So, so we came up with Immoral. Stripped, my original working title was Vegas Baby. They changed that to Stripped. And I like kind of the layers of meaning in Stripped, but I always liked Vegas Baby as a title. And in fact, several of the foreign editions, they went with Vegas Baby because it was sort of a generic title that did not need to be translated. I don't even remember what the working title of Stalked was originally. And In the Dark, sometimes it's pretty easy to find a title that everybody agrees on. In the Dark was just a pain. We went through all sorts of different titles, trying to get my UK and my US publisher on the same page about titles. And we finally had all agreed on In the Dark. And then, shortly before UK publication, we found out that another British crime writer was going to be coming out with a book like 3 weeks before mine called In the Dark. And so my UK publisher said, well, we don't want to have confusion in the marketplace. We've got to change the title. My US publisher said, well, we like In the Dark. So In the Dark became The Watcher over in the UK. And so same book with two different titles in English, which has been the bane of readers everywhere since then, who are always writing to me saying, well, what's this other book, The Watcher? Or from the UK writing, what's this other book, In the Dark? And they get very annoyed if they go out and buy both copies. I sort of snicker, and then I say, oh, that's really too bad. Other questions? Yeah?
Where do you live, and how much time did you spend in Washington Island?
Oh yeah, a lot of people assume I live in Duluth because so many of the books are based in Duluth, but actually I'm just over on the east side of the Twin Cities. I'm up in Duluth a lot in researching the books. Washington Island, I spent a lot of time in Door County. We've been to Door County many times. It's actually one of our very favorite places, so we go up there a lot. And then we rented a cottage, kind of the way I did for Stalked in Duluth, in order to be able to scout out locales in the Door County area. We didn't actually stay up on Washington Island because we stayed on the peninsula, but because even though they live up there, there's only certain segments of the book that are actually set on Washington Island, and the rest are set throughout the peninsula. But so I was driving around the back roads and the dirt roads and doing my same old thing. But at least it was during the summer, so I didn't get too many complaints from back home about that. So. Other questions? Yeah.
You must read other books also. Do you tend to read mostly mysteries, or do you read other genres?
Yeah, I used to read mostly in mystery and suspense. That was just my favorite genre. One of the challenges has been, and one of the sort of only downsides of being a writer has been that it's a lot harder for me to read and enjoy my own genre the way I used to. Because sort of the reality is that when you've been writing suspense all day long, the idea of curling up with someone else's suspense novel at the end of the day kind of feels suspiciously like work. It's kind of hard to lose myself in other people's stories the way I used to. I find myself sort of analyzing the book as opposed to really reading the book. So I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh, I like that. I would have done that a little differently. Oh, I see where he's going with that. And so it's harder. I've been trying to kind of push myself back into it and trying to kind of turn off the writer side when I'm reading, but I'm still working on that. So I've actually been doing more history and things of that nature. I've been reading more in biographies and things of that nature. Trouble is, I read history and I start thinking, oh, yeah, maybe I should write a historical novel. That would be fun. So, so it has the same impact on things. But if you're looking for other crime writers, one writer that I always recommend is Peter Robinson. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's not all that well known in the U.S., but he's a Canadian writer, and he writes detective novels set over in Yorkshire in the U.K. And terrific writer. I really enjoy his books. I think his book In a Dry Season I think it's one of the great detective novels of the past 20 years. It's just a terrific book. So, yeah.
Do you have long-term plans for your characters? Do you know, like for Jonathan Stride and maybe in Serena, do you have long-term plans for them, or as you write the novel, does it develop?
Yeah, do I have long-term plans for the characters? You know, I really don't. I always find that it becomes more real and it becomes more human if it develops along with what happens to them, because that's the way everyone's life unfolds. Things happen to them and it changes the dynamics of their lives. So I try not to plan it out too far ahead, because honestly I think what ends up happening in the various books changes them and shapes them and makes them go in different directions. And that's very much what happened with Burying Place, the fifth Stride novel. When I was starting The Burying Place, I did not have any sense of what was going to happen with the series characters, Stride, Serena, and Maggie. And early on in the book, it was clear to me what was going to happen among the three of them. And my concern was that readers were going to feel it was too much of a departure for them in terms of the emotional dynamics of those relationships. And around the time that I was starting to have this unfold in The Burying Place, I actually got the proofs back for In the Dark, which was the preceding book. And so I reread In the Dark, and I was astonished to find that all of the emotional foundation for what was going to be happening in The Burying Place was right there in the Dark. I didn't have a clue what I was going to do with them in The Burying Place, and yet everything was there, sort of tucked away in the cracks of that book. And so it's almost as if the characters sort of knew what was going to be happening to them next, and I was still waiting to figure that out. So no, I do like to let it evolve with each book, and that kind of shapes where they're going. And I think as I say, I think it just makes it more realistic, because it's changing their lives as events occur. Other question? Yeah.
Tell me about your daily writing routine.
My daily writing routine. Well, you know, I have this little cabin, and I'm just all in peace and tranquility, and deer are wandering by the window. No, that doesn't happen at all. It's pretty much like it's pretty much like any other job, in that I still kind of work on a 9-to-5 schedule, and I work Monday through Friday. I was in the traditional workforce for so long that that just feels natural to me. And so I get up in the mornings, and I will say that I get up in the mornings, and as much as I get great satisfaction out of the creative process, on any given day, there's probably just about anything I would rather do than stare at that blank screen. But that's the only way it gets done. So usually I kind of have to super glue my backside to a chair and sit there for several hours and let the material come. And I usually work each day until I can kind of feel the inspiration fade. I mean, it's actually kind of a pretty clear point where you sort of feel yourself going off a cliff creatively, and I've learned not to push it at that point. I just realize, okay, I'm kind of burned out for the day, and I find that it actually helps to have the weekend, because it's a very intense creative process throughout the week, and it's very sort of all-consuming during that period, and so it helps to have a couple days sort of gain a little bit of distance from the story and kind of recharge your batteries, and then dive in again on Monday. So, yeah.
If your book were to become a movie, who would your character be?
Oh, good question. Nothing stirs more passion and debate among readers than who should play the characters. And it's amazing what different responses I hear from readers about that. Me, I've always kind of thought, he's getting a little old for the role now, I think, but I think for Stride, I always thought that Russell Crowe could do Stride, because he's got kind of that right combination of emotional sensitivity and toughness that I think reflects who Stride is. Serena is a much more interesting question. Marcia and I have kind of a debate about that. She says Angie Harmon, you know, from Rizzoli and Isles and Law and Order. And I kind of always thought Catherine Zeta-Jones could do Serena. But the debate on that.
I did watch Zorro yesterday.
Well, see, there you go. But you know, I've heard so many different actors that people have suggested. Some people have suggested George Clooney for Stride. I get that a lot from different people. And I think, you know, to me, I look at it and go, Clooney is too sophisticated for someone like Stride. It just does not seem like the right fit to me. And yet, I mean, the reality is that actors make the parts. I can remember when they announced that you know, Matt Damon was going to be playing Jason Bourne in The Bourne Identity. I thought, Matt Damon? Oh, come on, looks like he's 14. How could he possibly pull off Jason Bourne? But you know, that's what actors do, and he grew into the part, and I thought did a tremendous job with it. Wouldn't have thought so beforehand, but you know, seeing him in the role, I thought he did a tremendous job. So that's, you know, in any given situation, finding the right actor is, you know, if they're good, you know, so many different actors I think can pull off the role. So.
Does that help writing a book if you got a character in mind, or?
No, not really. Not really. He's still sort of unique to me, and you know, the thing about movies is because readers will sometimes ask, you know, would you like to see your book made into a movie, or are you afraid that it would, you know, they'd sort of destroy it when they turn it into a movie? It's such a different artistic product. By the time a movie comes out, so many different artists have had their hands on that product, whether it's actors, directors, choreographers, set designers, musicians, that it's really a completely different experience than the book would have been at the beginning. And sort of the fun is to really see how was your inspiration turned into this different product. But movie making is a very different experience. You know, movies can really only activate two of your senses. You can see it and you can hear it, and they do that very, very well and very, very vividly. But again, I like to have books where all of your senses are activated, and I think that's also why passionate readers tend to be the ones that are often most disappointed by movie versions, because they've got this very clear image in their head of how the action takes place and who the characters are and what they're like. And invariably, the movie ends up disappointing because it doesn't do justice to what they've created for that book in their minds.
Is that why I always hate the movie?
I think so. I think that's exactly right.
Too much.
Yeah, I think the reader, the passionate reader, that book is so vivid in their minds that invariably what comes out on the movie screen does not do justice to the way the reader saw it, and so that's why they're so often disappointed by the movie versions of books. Frankly, too, I mean, readers tend to feel very proprietary about books they enjoy, I mean, I've learned, you know, from a very early point that once you've got books out there with readers, you no longer own your characters. You share ownership with the readers, and that's a trust I take seriously. I always tell people I'll never kill off one of my main characters. I may put them through hell, but I won't kill them off because I think that's sort of a betrayal of trust of the reader, and it really colors the reader's enjoyment of all of your books. Because if you wait and in book 10 you kill off a main character, it means the reader can't go back and get the same enjoyment out of the earlier books because their reading experience is now colored by what they know is going to happen to that character, and so I think that affects the movie version as well, because readers they like the book to be exactly as the book is, and invariably movies tend to change the book pretty markedly, and that annoys the passionate reader. So I was kind of I mean, Bourne Identity was I watched the Bourne Identity, and my reaction was, well, that was a great movie. It had nothing to do with the book, but it was a great movie.
So are you saying you wouldn't care to see your books made into movies?
Well, now let's not go that far. I saw Harlan Coben speak one time, and he had what I thought was the best comment about that. He said that when he thinks about Hollywood, he envisions himself on one side and Hollywood over here, and there's this big tall fence between them. and they just throw bags of money over the fence. So I thought, okay, yeah, that's a good description. It would be fun. I mean, it would be a lot of fun. You know, we came really close with the agency, the pseudonymous book. We had an executive producer in Hollywood who was really gung-ho about the book and was really interested in the movie version, knew what actress she wanted in the lead role, and it was just a question of timing. The timing was such that it was right when the recession was deepening. There was a threat of an actor's strike, and you know, those kinds of projects, you've sort of got a window of opportunity, and if you don't kind of get the deal done in the window, it's kind of hard to get it moving again. So yeah, it's always, you know, you never know what's going to happen on movie sites. It can happen tomorrow. It can happen in 10 years. It can never happen. So you just kind of have to cross your fingers. So, yeah.
How do you spell the name Allie?
The name Allie. Well, which one?
Well, for Allie O'Brien.
Allie O'Brien, A-L-L-Y, and it's O-B-R-I-E-N. And we actually have copies of it over there. Just mention that. Yes. Yes?
You didn't mention any possible actresses to play Maggie.
That's
seen that online? Even anybody suggest?
Well, you know, it's a tough one because there just aren't that many Asian actresses who are prominent. And everyone mentions Lucy Liu because after Lucy Liu, you start to get kind of a short list. Yeah, it really is. And I think that's one of the reasons that it doesn't come up because everyone just sort of looks at it and goes, oh, well, Lucy Liu, right? You know, but she's not short. Yeah, exactly.
Well, she's 5'3".
Is she really?
Barely short.
Oh gosh, she comes across as taller than that. So, yeah, I think that's the challenge. Is there are, you know, sadly few prominent Asian actresses in Hollywood right now. So it makes it kind of hard to know who to pick at that point. So. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening. And if you want to get any books or have them signed or chat further, I'm happy to hang around here. But thanks so much for coming out.